Well, hello and welcome to the Deeper Walk online conference called Slaying the Monster. My name is Nick Harang, and I'm so glad to be with you today as you are watching this, whether you're joining us live or you're catching the recordings at a later time. We are diving into something that is very, very important. As you'll hear, and you probably already know, this is an issue that is affecting pretty much every family, every household, every church, every nation around the world. And the enemy has been gaining so much ground. And so we are so glad that today we're going to be talking about some things of how you can take that ground back in your own life, and or how you can get equipped to also help others as they seek to find freedom from the monster that is pornography. And as you'll hear today, what we're talking about are not just tools and principles for this one issue, but really for any issue of addiction. And so we're going to talk about some of the divine blueprints and strategies that God has given us to find freedom and to walk in freedom and help others do the same. Today I'm joined by the president of Deeper Walk International, Marcus Warner. Hello, Marcus.
Hi, good to be with you, Nick.
So glad that you've written this book called Slaying the Monster, and you have put together our slides and the teaching content today. And myself as a director of Deeper Walk International and Amy Brown, our Journey Groups director, are going to be interacting with you today on this content and just sharing from the things that God has taught us through the years and our own journeys to freedom from things, as well as ministering to others. And so I do want to welcome Amy Brown, our Journey Groups director. Hello, Amy.
Hi, Nick. Hi, Marcus. It's good to be here.
Yep.
And just in case some of you guys don't know who these amazing people are, I'll give a brief intro. As I mentioned, Marcus is the president of Deeper Walk International and has been so for the last 14 years. Has written many books on many topics designed to help people grow in maturity, heart-focused discipleship being the theme of how to have that heart-to-heart relationship with God and people that really leads to lasting transformation in all the areas of our lives. And Amy, as I mentioned, is our Journey Groups director that had an idea of trying to find a way for people to live out these things we've been learning in community despite the distance. So thank God for technology, and thank God for some great ideas that God's given to Amy that has led to now hundreds of people all around the world in, I think, hundreds of groups that are really experiencing transformation. So thanks for being here, Amy. You've also had a lot of experience through the years teaching things related to addiction recovery. And so we're going to be very glad to pull on that information that you've learned and the things that you've seen really work.
Okay, great.
Well, great. Well, just to let you know where we're going, we're going to have a session, then we'll have some time for Q&A, and then a short break, and then we'll go into the next session. And so thank you again for joining us today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Marcus.
All right. Well, thank you, Nick. You know, it's interesting. I wrote this book because the director of the Every Man's Battle groups here in Carmel, Indiana, he is actually on staff at the church where Steve Arterburn is on the teaching faculty and who wrote the book Every Man's Battle. And he invited me to coffee one day just as I asked about the role of spiritual warfare in, you know, the recovery journey that people had. And along the way we got talking, and, you know, by the time we were done, he's like, man, you really ought to put some of this stuff into writing. And said, it sounds like you got something to contribute here. And it's not that I look at that because God has blessed me to just be exposed to a lot of people and a lot of things through the years that not everybody has had a chance to have the same kind of journey. The years of working with people who've had demonization problems, years of working with people in emotional healing and listening prayer with them, learning from Dr. Jim Wilder, all of the wonderful attachment theory and brain science. And I know all of us have benefited from that. And so what we're trying to do here is look at the fact that a lot of recovery processes are good at, what I find is they're good at 2 or 3 things, but very rarely do you get recovery processes that are doing all 6 of the strategies that we're going to be talking about today. And so a lot of people are good at having a group, but I got to tell you, I talked to a lot of people in recovery who said that their expectation was that once people came out and said, yeah, I admit I've got a problem, I'm joining a group, and they thought that that would be it, that that's all they needed to do was admit they have a problem, join a group, and everything would get better. And they didn't realize, like a year later, a lot of these places were starting to struggle with hopeless despair because they're like, you know, wait, this isn't changing us as much as we thought it would change us. And it's because they're missing so many elements of the process that goes into overcoming. This isn't a quick, easy fix in many cases, especially if it's been a deep dive into something. There are what we call breakthroughs, moments that you can have that help you on the journey, but along the way, unless there is a growth in overall maturity, we're just not going to see the kind of long-term effectiveness that people are after. So that was kind of the background behind the book and how it got started. Let's dive into why this is such a, take a closer look at the monster. I'll just throw up some stats here. These are very sad. And they actually came from, I have a new friend, Catherine Lee, who has starting a center down in Texas where they minister to women who have been trafficked for the purpose of primarily pornography and prostitution. And a lot of these stats come from her ministry. She said 90% of kids 8 to 14 have watched porn, most of them while doing homework. It's just become a standard thing. It's like kids just kind of prop it up to the side while they're doing other things in life. In fact, I found that a lot of times the shame that a lot of people in my generation felt about porn is disappearing in the younger generation because everybody does it. They don't have the same level of shame about it. Men with a porn habit are 300% more likely to have an affair. And in 56% of divorces, at least one party had an obsessive porn habit. Now those are pretty high numbers here. 24% of pastors describe their porn habit as a possible addiction. That means they don't just slip once in a while, like, oh shoot, I really shouldn't have looked onto that site. They're like it happens often enough. They're recognizing it as at the level of addiction. I've also talked to people in missions who have said that missionary, this is maybe the single fastest growing problem on the mission field. And so it's not just, leaders have this too. So it's also a growing problem among women. 73% of women have viewed porn in the last 6 months. I mean, that's a pretty staggering number, right? This used to be considered just a men's issue, but as it has broadened out, the narrative behind this is that it's a normal part of life. It's part of curiosity. There's nothing wrong with it, and the normalization of this has caused it to spread. And I do find it sometimes harder for women to come forward and admit that they've got an issue with this because it's thought of as a men's problem. As I mentioned before, porn drives the sex trafficking industry. And a lot of times we don't stop to think about the fact that most of the women that you're seeing in situations like this aren't there by choice, right? It's not we're feeding a bigger monster when we are involved in this monster as well. And then some other just stats, 37% of all internet traffic is porn. I mean, it's just staggering, right? So 37% of all internet traffic. And in 2006, it said the porn industry revenues were larger than Microsoft, Google, Amazon, eBay, Yahoo, Apple, and Netflix combined, and 90% of porn is free. So that tells you how much, just how staggering this issue is. And that stat again came from Catherine Lee's book and from also a website, Fight the New Drug. So pretty staggering numbers. As you can see, this is a monster. Now, I read a book one time that said, when you talk about the Holocaust, the death of 6 million Jews is just a number. But when you enter into the private suffering of one Jew, that's where you really feel the Holocaust. In the same way, all of these numbers are just kind of overwhelming. If you have fought this monster personally and you're in your own battle with it, you know how overwhelming this is, how hopeless it can feel, how defeated you can feel afterwards, and just the numbers themselves don't do justice to all that's involved here. So let's start off with the dive into this question. Why is porn so hard to overcome? Why can't we just say, this is stupid, I shouldn't be doing this, I'm done, right? Why can't we just do that? So let me just, before I dive into any more slides, why don't we give Nick and Amy a chance to jump in here. In your experience, guys, what is it about porn uniquely among addictions that makes it harder to overcome It just seems to be an entrenched sort of thing. Now, I know all addictions are, but is there anything unique about this that you've experienced?
Well, I think looking at the fact that all addictions are related to our innate desire to connect, and connection provides dopamine, and our sexual drive is a natural God-given means of connection. And so this is so closely related to that God-given means of connection. I think that makes the attraction so much stronger. That's the thought that comes to my mind.
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. I think that you hit on a couple of key things there. That this is designed by God in our nature to be sexual beings. And so Satan likes to take what Satan has created and twist it into something God didn't intend it to be. And so we have a natural drive in direction. And many of the things that we're seeking for in porn are actually good things that we're seeking. We're just going to the wrong thing to get it.
Right.
So, anything you want to add, Nick, or should we go on?
I think I'll have more to add later. Amy covered that really well. That's a great point.
All right. So one of the things that's helped me understand this a bit, and we're going to talk about why all addictions are so hard, and we just call it underdeveloped maturity. And it was really Jim Wilder who helped understand the role of this, because my expectation was, as somebody who started out walking people through the steps to freedom, I saw a lot of people who would just have one appointment and they would confess all this stuff, they'd renounce all this stuff, they'd command the demons to leave, and they were good to go, and they would come back with testimonies how, they'd been clean for years. But then there were other people who go through the same thing and they'd fall again in a week. And you're like, well, what's the difference? Why are some people have these amazing breakthroughs and other people don't? And it causes people to feel shame, like, well, I didn't do it right. There's something wrong with me. I must be really, twisted or bad or something, because, I heard this guy's testimony and he got free in one session and I didn't. So what's wrong with me? Well, this is really the answer to that. And that is that you can think of underdeveloped maturity as a lack of skills and a lack of capacity. Now, lack of skills, meaning, I look at it this way. It's like, if I didn't know how to play the piano before I had demons cast out, I still don't know how to play the piano afterwards. If I didn't know how to quiet myself and return to joy from upsetting emotions before I experience deliverance, before I go through some kind of inner healing thing, I still don't have that skill afterwards. So underdeveloped maturity is related to skills that we miss. So we're going to be talking about that along the way. And it's also related to just the idea of capacity. So we're going to use the image of a bucket to talk about this. Let me just give you 4 quick things. Say, how do I know if I have underdeveloped capacity? There are 4 quick characteristics, 4 A's here, right? And that is, I get angry easily. And what I mean by that is that I can be fine 1 minute and it takes almost nothing for me to erupt. It's like, just push a tone of voice, a little push of the button, all of a sudden, bam, I'm like full of anger all of a sudden. And that's a sign of low emotional capacity. It just doesn't take much to set that off. Anxiousness, and that is where I have this constant low level line of anxiousness, means that I can't quiet. I don't know how to take deep breaths and calm myself, and I don't know how to feel okay in between things. So there's just constant low level anxiety in my life. Avoidance becomes a habit, and avoidance is I avoid hard people, I avoid hard situations, and as a result, I tend to fill my day with things that don't require me to interact with people, that don't require me to do hard things, which is why a lot of people just surf the internet and watch TV all day, because it doesn't ask for anything from them. And then the last thing is addiction. And all people with underdeveloped maturity are going to be addicted to something. It's just a question of what they're addicted to. So these are some of the ways you go, well, how do I know if I'm struggling with this? You kind of go through the checklist. Do I have any of these things? Are they characteristic of what's going on in my life? That means, yeah, there's some holes now in my maturity development. Now, we're blessed here. We've got 2 people who teach on maturity regularly. So, Amy, do you want to walk them through the idea of maturity and the joy bucket here?
Yeah. So in order to deal with the stresses of life in a healthy way, we need a bucket full of maturity. And so our bucket is filled as we have these ongoing interactions, healthy relational interactions, and interactions in joy. In other words, when we are glad to be together, that releases dopamine, and that is like a nice surge into my bucket. And then when I'm able to quiet well, whether it is with another person, when we sit quietly, maybe, looking at, at nature, sitting on a bench in the woods, um, or by myself or with the Lord, that releases serotonin. And so that fills my bucket. And so when I have a full bucket, then I am emotionally mature and I have enough capacity to deal with the stresses of life without turning to non-relational things.
That's great. Now let's talk about dopamine and serotonin just a little bit more then. So dopamine, Nick, what have you learned about dopamine, serotonin along the way?
Well, the dopamine, that's that feel-good chemical that we feel when we are connecting with someone or also having some sort of pleasurable experience. Carbohydrates, chocolate, sugar, and some of the other things, illegal drugs, whatnot, they can release that dopamine, which is that really good feeling we feel. And again, it's designed to be something that we experience primarily through relational connection, through connecting with a friend. I remember so many times not wanting to go to small group, but I hosted it. So I didn't really have a choice. And then after it was over, here I was tired going into it, coming out of it, I was like, oh, that was really good. And I can't tell you what we talked about, but looking back, I think I had a dopamine surge because I was connecting with people in a relational environment. And something in my brain was saying, this is really what you're made for, is connection. And then as Amy said, that quieting, that we're meant to live on rhythms of joy and connection, and then quieting and disconnection. So that quieting, that releases that calming chemical of serotonin, is just, we're meant to kind of have those rhythms throughout our days and throughout our lives. And that's what God designed us for, is what the Bible calls joy and peace. And you see that over and over in Scripture.
Now, that's good. And I've also heard that there's, I think it's, I honestly, I get my words confused. Is oxytocin? There's another one in here, right? That, and somebody calls it like the bonding hormone versus dopamine. And the way I've heard this described is dopamine really doesn't care who you're having sex with. It just wants the pleasure. But oxytocin will bond you to this person. So oxytocin just wants to have sex with your wife or your husband, right? It's a special thing that builds a bond between two people. And so one of the things that I think also is helpful to understand is sometimes we just want a dopamine rush and we don't care how we get it. We're designed to get the dopamine through relational experience, but if we can't find the relational experience, we don't have the skills for it, we don't know how to do that, then we find ourselves turning to alternative non-relational ways to get that same rush. And so that's good for us to kind of keep in mind too. So what happens in here, we're going to talk about A, B, and C trauma. So let's just dive into A trauma. A trauma, I think, Amy, you have described this as just a bucket that isn't full enough, right? It's like,
right. Yeah. If you have A trauma, then your bucket you will reach adulthood with a very limited capacity in your bucket.
Yeah. So again, Dr. Wilder describes this as absence, right? It's what we missed out on. And I often tell people, what you don't get can kill you. If you don't get enough water for a long enough period of time, you'll die. If you don't get enough oxygen, you can die, right? There's what you don't get can have a devastating effect on your life. In the same way, what you don't get can have a devastating effect on your development. And so missing key skills and experiences of children leaves us with underdeveloped maturity. And that's what we mean by A trauma. What are some of the key skills and things that you found that oftentimes that you notice that people have missed out on along the way, what are some of the things people miss that create this, stall
so
of maturity?
We learn, our brain learns to produce dopamine through interactions where someone is glad to be with us, where we are the apple of their eye. Their eyes sparkle when they see us. And that is, of course, what God intends in childhood, in infancy. And so as we have those interactions with people in our lives and it produces this joyful feeling, our brain makes a note and says, let me go back to that. So if we don't get that, then our brain is still going to learn to produce dopamine somehow. And so we might, I taught addiction recovery for a long time. And so I would tell people, if you didn't have these interactions with your parents, then the first time you go to a party and somebody hands you some beer and you drink it and you get that rush, then you're very susceptible to wiring your brain to receive dopamine from that, because your brain goes, wow, I need this. And that is right. You do need it. So building joy together, quieting, that Nick and I have both mentioned, those are two really basic skills. And so if our parents didn't quiet well with us or comfort us when we were young, then we will look for things that will help us quiet. And so it could be porn, it could be alcohol, it could be shopping, it could be food, that helps us quiet our negative feelings. So, I had a conversation with Jim Wilder once, and I said that I felt personally kind of bad because I didn't have any big B traumas in my life. But there was A trauma, there was absence of some things. And I remember Dr. Wilder looking at me and saying, a lot of people can recover well from B trauma, but A trauma always leaves a mark. And it is so insidious because what you don't know, you're missing. And so we're not, with the B trauma, well, you'll talk about that in a moment, but we know we've been hurt.
Yeah.
If we never got something, we don't realize we should have received it.
Yeah. No, the concept of A trauma has been really one of those big aha moments with it, because I'm the same way. I didn't have any significant B trauma in my life, but I realized pretty early on that I had developed both some dismissive tendencies and some distracted tendencies in the way that I bonded with people. And what happens with porn is it appeals to both dismissive and distraction, right? Because the dismissive doesn't want to bond to a person, but still wants that feeling. And so porn allows you to do that. I don't have to bond to anybody and I can still get this feeling. Distraction is like, well, I'm doing this, but wow, look at that. And all of a sudden that's all like, wow, that was distracting. Now I'm looking at this and next thing I know, I'm following that distraction to the next one. So both of those things can affect that. I know in my own journey, when I was 7 years old, I found a box of porn magazines in our neighborhood, and a couple of friends and I, it's age 7, are like, we had that wow experience, like what in the world, never even thought about anything like this, and nothing else in life would give you that sensation, right? So there's nothing else that we could do that made us feel like that, and so like day after day we go, well, let's go do that again, let's go look at that again, and so you have this wow. Well, that kind of gets into the B trauma, because actually when that happened to me, that was a form of B trauma, because that was something bad that happened to me. And it's important for people to understand that we need to treat our first exposure to porn as trauma, as a traumatic event. And so because what's supposed to happen, that wow event that happened for me at age 7 is supposed to happen on your wedding night, right? On your wedding night, you're supposed to go, wow, this is amazing, right? And then it bonds you to that person, and you're supposed to have this hyper glue bonding experience on that wedding night that you want to repeat over and over again with that person, so that there's lots of oxytocin bonding you together, and all and you learn to have dopamine together in the sexual experience, and you learn to have serotonin together afterwards as you quiet together after that. And so now what's happening is you're having this really great bonding, soothing, quieting, high energy, low energy, just nice bonding experience. But when it actually gets robbed from you when you have that experience through porn before outside of your marriage. It causes you to actually bond to images, right? you know, I can still remember the face, you know, that first person I ever saw, right? That image just exploded on there. Now you have a bond to that. And so so we're looking at, in the same way, not only does porn do this, but sexualized trauma in and of itself, I think, predisposes people to a porn addiction versus other kinds of addictions. And that is that most of the people I've talked to who had really deeply rooted porn addictions also had sexualized B trauma in their past, because it sort of predisposed them to the idea that this is, that there's a connection there. Now, not always, but there was a high percentage of that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So any other thoughts on this before I go to the C?
Well, I would just add too that it heightens the level of trauma if your first experience was porn came from finding it or associated with someone that you love. So if you found a parent or uncle or grandparents porn stash, because that's very frequently how kids have their first experience with
Mm-hmm.
it, then that adds to the trauma, because this is one of your important attachment figures, and our brains are just not wired to see that at such an
Yeah.
early age. So,
Well, and since a lot of people know my dad, let me just say it wasn't his. Okay, so yeah, it was not that case. So, all right, let's go look at C trauma. The C trauma has to do with comparison and perspective. It's this idea that I am actually wounded by my belief, if you will. Whereas A trauma and B trauma open the doors to false beliefs, C trauma kind of is the damage just done by a false belief that didn't necessarily have a wound underneath it, but it's still a traumatizing belief. So for example, if I look at somebody else and I go, you know, well, that's what you're supposed to look like, and I don't look like that. So now I have they didn't do anything to wound me, but I've been wounded by my comparison of myself to that person, going, I don't have value, I don't have worth unless I look like that. I don't have value, I don't have purpose unless I can, you know, perform like that, unless I have someone who looks like that unless somebody who looks like that is, you know, in love with me, then I don't have value or worth. That's kind of C trauma. That's this idea that I'm not wounded by what they've done to me, but what I believe about this relationship, or what I believe about the non-relationship, is actually having a very devastating effect on me directly. So I've talked to a lot of people who their trauma journey started with C trauma. That is sometimes, well, one of the first times I met with somebody who had a really strong porn addiction, this guy had been in therapy for 7 years with traditional Christian counselors for his porn addiction. And we'll talk about this more later, but one of the things I found was that part of his journey was that he had a C trauma with his older brother, where he looked at his older brother as, now that's what a real man is, right? A real man is somebody that all the girls want to be with and all the guys want to flock to. And then he felt like he was, underdeveloped, that he was not a chick magnet, right? He was not somebody that everybody was flocking to. And so by comparing himself to his brother, he had an inferiority problem that made him more susceptible to trying to find non-relational ways to feel better. And so in his case, the C trauma was one of the core elements that was leading to his later porn addiction. All right, so let's talk about some brain issues, right? The brain issues specifically related to why this is so hard, why this is so big. We've already talked about dopamine, pleasure versus joy. Nick, you want to just lay out the difference between pleasure and joy a little bit for us? Because I know you're probably reading emails, but because people are asking questions, you're probably already looking at people's questions, but pleasure versus joy, like what's the difference between pleasure and joy? Why do we separate those?
Yeah, well, I think at a simplest level, joy is relational. Joy, again, is defined and experienced by your brain as someone is glad to be with me that I'm glad to be with. And there's a huge difference between the joy that is relational and pleasure, which feels really good, that's non-relational. And I think to me, the big difference is one really satisfies and the other one kind of leaves you wanting more. If you have a really great conversation with a friend and you spend an hour over coffee catching up and just you walk away, I just felt great. You've got some of those pleasurable chemicals released in your brain, but you've got a sense of satisfaction from the fact that it was a relational experience. And yet if I eat like a big piece of chocolate cake, something's like, well, I want more. I want more. And, you know, there's a lot of diminishing returns at work there, isn't there? So pleasure isn't bad. It's a gift from God, but it's meant to be experienced. I should enjoy that cake with a friend, or thanking God for that cake and making even the pleasure I experience a relational experience so that I can find satisfaction.
Yeah, that's a good distinction, this idea of the connection between joy with relationship and the joy with satisfaction versus pleasure that just wants more. That's a really good distinction. I remember seeing a TV show once where a guy told a girl, and I thought it was really insightful for as immature as this character was, that he said, because she wanted him to fall in love with him. And so she was thinking, well, if I can get him to have sex with me, he'll fall in love with me. And the guy said, look, sex doesn't lead to love. Sex just leads to more sex. And that was really, I thought, very insightful on his part. Like, this is not going to make me fall in love with you. It's just going to make me want to do this again with you. Right. So what I think we find this in a lot of different settings, that when we are looking just for that rush and just for that joy, we just, like I said, dopamine doesn't care how I'm getting it. It just wants that experience or that rush. Whereas joy finds that if I'm doing this in God's designed way, that there is a satisfaction to it and there is a relational dimension to it. So in the book that Chris Kersey and I wrote, 4 Habits of Joy-Filled Marriages, we talk about the difference between relational sex and performance sex. And it gets to this kind of idea that even in marriage, you can have relational sex or you can have performance sex. Relational sex is there's a high and there's a rest together, and it's a very bonding experience where it is a shared thing. A performance sex is where it is all about technique and one person making sure they get what they want out of the experience. And so it can be traumatizing even within marriage if we can't find a way to bring a relational dimension to the experience and keep it from just being performance. Can't tell you how many stories I've heard of people, you know, even on their wedding night would watch porn first and then they would have sex. And it's like, it's completely backwards. They're thinking like, oh, this will get us in the mood or something, or help show us how to do it better. But it doesn't. It takes it from being a relational experience and turns it into a performance experience. So, you know, I encourage people, you know, keep it out of your marriage too. It's not going to help. We also see that there is that because it needs more, anybody who's worked with this or been around it knows that the same amount of exposure doesn't do the same thing for you. You need more of it the next time. You need more of it and more of it. And I talked to a pastor friend of mine, and they had to recall one of their missionaries because he brought his laptop in for repairs. And when they found the laptop, the guy had so much porn on his laptop, and it was getting really dark. And you just watch the trail, right, of like how it started off here and it ended up down here. And I know stories of pastors who started off here and they ended up, you know, with prostitutes in hotel rooms. Never thought it would ever go that direction, but it just needed more and more and more and more because there wasn't the satisfaction element to it. There was only the high energy pleasure part of it. So that's one of the reasons this is such a monster, right? Is that it is something that, because you never get the relational satisfaction with it, it demands more of you as you go. Let's talk about amplification of the brain. Now, the idea of amplification is the idea that your brain is kind of has a radar and a spotlight, right? So the radar is looking around constantly for what's important. What should I pay attention to? Out of everything out in the world, what should I pay attention to? And so, and then that's the right side of your brain is constantly doing the radar thing. And then the left side of your brain puts a spotlight on what it tells you is important. And so your brain can be taught what to put the spotlight on in its life. So for some of us, our brain has taught us to put the spotlight on fear, right? What is there to be afraid of? What is there to, you know, and fear is my brain has learned to look for whatever is scariest in life and focus on that. Other of us, our brain has learned look for pleasure, you know, look for this. And so our brain has been wired to look for it. And now the brain is it amplifies the whole thing and it makes it bigger and bigger and bigger because that's the biggest thing that my brain knows to look for. And so part of what we're having to do is to retrain our brain to stop amplifying pleasure and begin amplifying joy, right? As our brain learns to amplify relational joy, we can begin to retrain our brain about saying, what am I supposed to shine the spotlight on here? What am I supposed to be looking for? So that's why I say your brain looks for what's important to you, and it begins to crave what is important to you. And so if you're constantly putting the spotlight on the wrong thing, your brain will just learn to crave that wrong thing. But the more that your brain learns to amplify things that are positive, and life-giving and satisfying, then you can begin to retrain your brain. It generally takes about 30 days for your brain to begin to form a new habit. And so you can think in those same way, that to train your brain to do something is not a matter of just saying, doggone it, I'm going to stop doing this, I'm never doing it again. It is a process that's going to take, you need to be thinking in terms of a couple of months in terms of retraining your brain. Anything else on amplification you guys have come across?
Yeah, it's been so helpful for me to understand the 5-level processing pathway that our brain uses. First read about this in your book that you wrote with Jim Wilder called Rare Leadership. And it's just helped me a ton because level 1, that first part of our brain processing pathway, notices, as you said, what's relevant. Right now, I'm not thinking about the fact, well, I am now, but there's a gray wall in front of me. It's not very relevant, so my brain just tunes it out. But if I walk into Home Depot and I'm looking for a PVC pipe and there's a pretty lady on the same aisle, my brain notices that. And I used to beat myself up about that. Like, well, why do I notice that? Why do I care? And what I realized is a couple things are going on, I think. One is that God actually designed us to notice beauty. I notice a beautiful sunset. I notice beautiful flowers. I notice the beautiful smiles of my children when they're in a good place. And so if I go to Home Depot and I'm looking for a not that beautiful PVC pipe and there's a pretty lady on the same aisle, my brain notices that. That's just going to happen. But what's been helpful for me is to realize, okay, that's level 1. It's going to notice, just like it's going to notice the red blinking open sign on the window. It's just, hey, there's a red blinking sign. Pay attention is what my brain says before conscious thought. So now what am I going to do with that? Oh, there's a pretty lady. Well, God bless her. And I'm going to get my PVC pipe and I'm going to go check out. So I'm training my brain what to do with what I notice versus like, well, I noticed that. And, that gives me a little dopamine hit and I'm going to pursue that trail and just follow that where it leads. It's like, no, I'm going to redirect, notice, acknowledge, and pursue the things that are in line with my values, which is the level 4. And I'll stop there and not give too much of a brain science lecture right now. But it's just been helpful to know that it's not bad to notice beauty. It's not wrong. It's going to happen. So what do I do with it? How do I train my brain to respond in a good way?
Very good. All right, let's, our last thing here is on brain issues, relational circuits, right? So we got relational circuits in the brain. Amy, you want to walk us through the kind of the dimmer switch and relational circuits and how they work in the brain?
Yeah, so Nick talked about level 1, and level 1 is scanning all the time for what is personal to me, what matters to me, and then it passes that information. Hey, this is something personal, up to level 2, and level 2 evaluates it as, and level 2 is limited. This is still subconscious, outside of your conscious thought. And he evaluates everything as good, bad, or scary. So something either is, that's okay, and we'll just keep it going up to levels 3, 4, and then 5, or this is bad, so it kind of produces some anger, and both bad and scary produce a lot of energy. And when we see that they are bad or scary, our brain has some options. And so a brain that tends to get stuck at that level will start dimming our connection to levels 3 and 4, which are the parts of the brain that can actually calm those feelings. It can make good choices about what we want to do with the situation. So it is a dimmer switch though. So that is encouraging, because as we notice that we are becoming less relationally connected. So if I notice that I'm starting to feel like, I don't really care what you think right now. So if Marcus is talking to me and it sounds to me like he's about to fire me, well, my level 2 might say, okay, this looks bad. this looks really bad. And my relational circuits start turning down. I am not listening to what Marcus is saying. I'm not taking it in. And so if I shut off, then I may make some decisions that are really bad. But the good news about it being a dimmer switch is that we can recognize, oh, this is going south. I want to quiet myself so that I continue to stay relational in this situation. And so if Marcus is talking to me and it sounds like, oh, could this end in me being fired? Then I take some deep breaths. Okay, I know what Marcus is like, and I don't think that's how this would go. Let me ask some more questions and find out where we're going here. So my relational brain stays on. So the problem with addictions is that we are very wired to what it is that that we are bonded to. And so that cuts off our access to our relational brain, especially if someone challenges our access, because our level 2 is designed to protect our attachments. And so this relational circuit is going, this is why we will, you're attacking my attachment. So this is why we will do things that will hurt our relationships when we never expected to, because our relational brain gets shut down and we are just attached to our porn, our shopping, our spending, our food, whatever it is, our performance, our work. So then we are not connected to the parts of our brain that can actually process situations well, and our identity center, where it reminds us, oh, okay, you are a relational person, you care about the people in your family, and you want to stay connected. And so how is it like me to act in this situation? So we want to keep our relational circuits open, and that's a matter of practice and noticing these signs that our relational brain is dimming, our circuits are dimming.
No, that's really helpful. And I think that, one of the points I've made in a couple of men's groups that I've talked to is how a lot of guys have this experience of they get done watching, and then it's like afterwards their circuit comes back on and they remember who they are and how it's like them to act. And like, what just happened? Who was that? Right? That's not me. Why was I doing that? And they don't understand, and they go, what's going on with that? And understanding relational circuits has been very helpful for them, because what happened was the dimmer switch in their case went off.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the dimmer switch went off, they had no access to their identity, and they literally did turn into a different person, and they were not acting like themselves. And so as their circuits begin to warm back up and start coming back on, and they start remembering who they are and how it's like them to act, they're going, wait a second, this isn't good. And now they've got a choice about, how am I going to deal with this, right? Now, am I going to hide this from people? I can't let anybody find out that this sort of thing happens. And we're going to talk about that. What do you do, when you have fallen? How do you get back to your relational self? But also, a lot of people don't believe it's possible to share shameful things about themselves and have a relationship stay intact. And there are reasons for that, because it takes a certain amount of maturity on the other person's part to stay relational with you when you share, something overwhelming. So we'll talk about that as we move forward, but I think we're wrapping up our opening session. Let me just give you a preview of where this is going. We got 6 battle strategies. And I got a lot of pushback from this book because it was not organized in an acrostic, right? It's like, why are the 6 strategies not an acrostic? So here we are, just for you guys. We put them into an acrostic today. So it's the word battle, and it's building community, act like yourself, tackle the roots, take down the enemy, live in the spirit, and expand your maturity. So those are the 6 strategies we're going to be looking at. Although honestly, Nick came up with a great, he said, if we change build community to create community, we get cattle, and then we can use cow branding. And I thought that was pretty clever, but we'll stick with battle for right now. So we got 6 battle strategies on, and we're going to take some questions now from session 1. And then when we come back, we'll be diving into this idea of building community. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about the relational versus pleasure part of addiction, why it's so important for us to have good relationships.
Yeah. Thank you, Marcus and Amy, for sharing just rich insights. And as Marcus said, now's the time for you to go ahead and chat in questions. I'll just read them off, and Marcus or Amy or I'll try to answer them as best we can.
Before since we don't have any questions yet, I wanted to add that as we begin to bond to these non-relational things, it weakens our relational bonds. And so that is so powerful for us to realize, and it can be very motivating for us to realize, okay, I am actually weakening my bond with my spouse as I'm engaging with this. But it's the same is true if I am, if my addiction is shopping or working out or working or, anything else. So that is how we lose that attachment. And so everything becomes about the porn rather than about our spouse or our children.
Yeah,
that's really great.
Good observation. Yeah, because there are a lot of because your brain is learning to amplify your craving for the non-relational thing rather than learning to amplify its need and desire for something deeper.
Yeah, and Marcus, your bullet point on the slide said that porn turns our relational circuits off, and Amy already sort of covered this, but I just want to make it clear that if our relational circuits are off, we're much more prone to look at porn or to turn to an addiction, because again, we're wired for relational connection, and we're going to find it either in a relational way or a non-relational way. But non-relational ways we can control, they're easy to get, they produce a very significant high. So I think one of the biggest things that I've learned, and again, it started with reading Rare Leadership, was like, wow, there's this whole relational circuitry on the right side of my brain that I just thought you either had it, you're wired to be left brain or right brain. That's just kind of the way you are, and you can't really change it. And I'm just a left brain kind of smart guy. When I realized, wow, no, there's this whole relational side of my brain that God designed to be on. He designed me to be in relational mode all the time. And if I can partner with God in how he designed me, then my whole brain, my whole person functions much more the way God designed. And so the best defense against sin and non-relational substitutes for is actually a good offense. And that is learn to recognize when my RCs are dimming or off, take responsibility for that, and grow the capacity to live in relational mode more and more. So somebody asked a question that feeds right into this. I'll let you guys comment if you want, but they said, so when I don't feel like being relational, I need to develop my relational capacity, right? How would you guys respond to that?
Yeah. Yes. So our brain learns it becomes wired to certain things. And so if we are not feeling very relational, we need to turn to some relational things and increase the amount of relational connection. And our brain produces the dopamine. And at first it can be challenging. When we are not wired to relationship, it can be challenging. And so we want to learn. And at some point, I don't know, Marcus, do you want me to tell my story about my country fellow that had to?
Yeah, I was saying we get to that in our next session. So
okay. So we do need to learn to build our relational capacity through connections and joy, and practice in quieting ourselves particularly.
Yeah, I also say that part of this is learning to recognize when your relational circuits go off and where or when they get really dim, and beginning to understand that the problem I have to solve right now is how to get my relational circuits back on. Mm-hmm. For a lot of us, we're so used to identifying other problems that need to get solved at that point that our mind is focusing on the wrong things. Whereas if we recognize, oh, you know what, my relational circuits are off right now, I should probably do something to try to get those back on. And let's face it, this happens when I'm tired, it happens when I'm upset, it happens when I'm overwhelmed. So when are we most susceptible to any addiction? It's when I'm tired, it's when I'm upset, and it's when I'm overwhelmed. So I want to be especially aware that those are also the times that it's most likely that my relational circuits will be off or very dim. And so I need to learn to recognize that that's happening and going, you know, what I really need right now is to take a little rest, take a walk, get away, you know, and then because you can't, there isn't always somebody there to bond to. And so you're like, all right, maybe what I really need right now is a little rest. And then I'll feel more like myself and I can, you know, take off with things. But I find that if we don't recognize what the problem is we're trying to solve, we're much more susceptible to going for a wrong solution. I see somebody too asked a question of the different, you know, more on the difference between relational and performance sex, which is happy to go into. Let me use the analogy of basketball for a second. And that is, I played a lot of basketball in my life, and there was a difference between thinking about what I was doing and trying to get every shot perfect and trying to, you know, to play perfect basketball. And there is a difference between that and just playing with joy and playing as a team and playing, you know, and enjoying the experience of what was happening there. That's one level. And a second level related to that is that there's a difference between playing selfish basketball and playing team basketball. And in the same way, performance sex tends to drive you to selfishness. And so the idea here is there could be great performance as long as it is shared and that it is something that is making both people feel closer to each other when you're done. But that's the ultimate thing. It's like if you get done and you don't feel any closer to the person, then you are engaging in performance sex, not in relational sex. If you get done and there, it's like, and it doesn't leave you feeling happy to be with them, then that was performance versus relational.
All right, great. Yeah, somebody asked about the fact that they had joy growing up in their family, and yet as a 9-year-old they were exposed to porn, and would that still be a trauma? I think we probably classify the exposure to porn as B trauma, but that was a bad thing. It felt like a very good thing because it was this overwhelming rush of all these positive chemicals and feelings that you're supposed to experience on your wedding night, as Marcus said. But it was a bad thing because it was more than you were designed to handle in a non-relational setting at the wrong age and stage of life, in the wrong relational context. So you could have had a great family and still something very bad was introduced that damaged you.
Yeah, I can't speak as much of the female experience, but for guys at that age, there is an encouragement that, wow, congratulations, you found the good thing, right? And so nobody is treating it like trauma. Nobody's kind of saying, oh, you poor guy, I'm so sorry you had to see that, right? It's like, wow, aren't you lucky? Where could we get more of that? And so the culture doesn't treat it like trauma at all. And as a result, most of us never think about treating it like trauma, because the culture doesn't treat it that way. And probably our friends or whoever else may have known about it or participated in things like that didn't treat it that way either. So that's why, yeah, it would be a B trauma.
Yeah, someone asked about building relational connection with the Lord and how does that fit in? And so, yes, absolutely. There is an amazing change that happens in our lives when we cultivate our sense of being loved and enjoyed by our amazing Creator and Father and Savior. So we're going to talk more about that in the session on coming up. And I think maybe we might just...
Spirit. Yeah, we'll be talking about that and living in the Spirit.
Yeah,
I will just point out one thing on that right now, and that is that if you think about living in the Spirit, one of the biggest obstacles to that is when my relational circuits go off, right? Because walking in the Spirit is about a relationship with God. And so I can have a good relationship with God, fall into a hole, right, and find myself doing something else. So they are connected, but we'll talk more about that in that session on living in the Spirit.
All right, a couple more questions, and I think we're going to go to a break. Somebody said, what if I don't want to be relational because I'm offended or hurt or angry? How do I get past being offended?
Well, you know, that's a good point, because you don't, being relational doesn't necessarily mean I have to be happy to be with that person, like my wife right now, or my husband. And if I am offended, you know, it can take a little bit of, it can take time, and there are times when you shouldn't be with that person right now. It depends on what's going on here, because it's not a one size fits all answer. It depends on how big that offense is and how, you know, profound that is. You might want to, you know, it might need some space because there's trust that needs to get reestablished. One of the biggest mistakes I've seen like wives make, especially that I've met with, is their husbands will have an affair and they turn around and have sex with them the day they find out about it. I'm like, no, 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 man, you need to put some space there, and you need to restore some things, and you need to build some stuff up before you just jump right back in there, because you're talking about forgiveness and reconciliation. And forgiveness you can do immediately. You know, you can choose to forgive somebody, but the reconciliation is about rebuilding trust in the relationship. And there's some steps that need to be taken in that, not just something that happens in a moment.
All right, I don't know if we want to answer this one at the next session or this one, but somebody asked, can you quickly summarize the 5 levels of the brain and how they relate to the porn issue here?
Sure. The 5 levels of the brain look like this. Let's take this, the bottom. It's attachment center, and the attachment center is the thing that lights up when something is like, it's that radar that says, this is important, pay attention to this. So attachment center lights up. The assessment center then says about what just led up. This is either good, in which case everything functions normally, or it says this is bad, which makes me angry, or it's scary, which makes me want to run away, or if it's too overwhelming, it just makes me freeze. So then what happens is at the attunement level is level 3, and this is the part of the brain that is the radar. It's the synchronizing with the world around me, and it's where I experience mutual mind. So for example, right now, even though we're on video, like I can make eye contact with Amy or Nick and kind of get a knowing like, hey, we need to wrap up, speed this up, you know, something like that. And there's nonverbal communication that you can get. So level 3 is where I read body language. And so if it's working well, I read that accurately. If it's not working well, I misread cues. So, but that's, so it's the attachment, assessment, attunement, and then we call it the action center, is where both the joy and the identity center of the brain are located. So this is where the joy bucket would be that Amy is talking about. And the bigger that joy bucket gets, the easier it is to regulate what's happening down below here. So you'll hear a lot about emotional regulation in attachment circles. And what that is talking about is having a big enough identity and joy center that when this gets triggered for something bad or scary, this doesn't shut down. Right? The relational circuits stay on. If the relational circuits stay on, then this part of my brain stays engaged, and it can help me regulate these emotions, quiet myself, return to joy, and act like myself despite what's going on. But if my this gets so big, right? If my anger or my fear gets so big that I shut down, it's like your brain goes into a cramp. And just like when your muscle cramps, you can't run, you can't walk, you can't do anything. In the same way, when your brain cramps up, you know, you lose all the access over here. And so you go over to the problem solving part of your brain on the left side, and the problem solving part of your brain, when this is shut down, usually doesn't think, you know, the problem is that my brain is in a cramp. I should probably do something to get it back on, you know, back and engaged. I think this wasn't happening till you showed up, so you must be the problem. So I'm going to treat you like a problem and go after you. And so that's what we're looking at is even if I am going to deal with offense in somebody else, if I have to deal with that kind of offense, what I want to do is I want to make sure that my brain gets uncramped and back online and functioning better, because once this gets online, I will do better problem solving on how I should deal with what's happening in our relationship. That's the 5 levels in a nutshell. And the 5th level, in case you missed it, was the left side of the brain. So it's these 4, and then the left side of the brain is level 5, which is the narrative part. Just give you an example of it. It's like if you're feeling shame gets triggered in here. When shame gets triggered, shame's just a feeling. It's the left side of my brain that makes shame toxic, because that's the part of my brain that's going to give it a narrative, give it a meaning, and say, well, you're feeling this because you're a bad person. So it doesn't actually become toxic until it gets to the other side of the brain. So again, this is just a helpful model. You'll see we talk about it a lot in almost all of our courses. Nick has a course on the 5 levels of the brain. If you want to take a deeper dive, I really highly recommend that one.